Hi folks, this is first lecture, Early History of Psychology. Let's dive into it. Here's an outline of what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to define psychology briefly. I'm going to talk also very briefly about some of the issues that people, ancient and through kind of Renaissance thinkers, debated. And then I'm going to review the three early approaches from the late 1800s to psychology. First, the definition of psychology. I want you to kind of stop and think. If I were to ask you in class to define this, what would you say it is? And maybe jot down your guess. And I'm not going to force you to give it in class, obviously. What is psychology? The study of. And here's the actual definition. It is the scientific study of mental processes and behavior. So the words in colors are important to note. Number one, it's a science. Number two, it's looking at our mind or our mental processes and our behavior. We're just going to shorten that to MP and B sometimes, but I'm talking about the mind and behavior, or mental processes and behavior. I didn't put it on the agenda, but I am going to briefly mention the goals of psychology. What are you hoping to accomplish in psychology? And again, it's good to stop and try to figure out, okay, what would I say the goals of psychology are if I were asked? And that's obviously a very hard question, cold, but if you think about it ahead of time before I say it, it helps it stick in your head better. So what are these goals of psychology? Number one, it's just trying to describe. We are trying to, when we do psychology, to describe what's going on in the mind and to describe behavior. That's actually harder than it seems. The second one, if you get description, now you can probably get the second one. We don't want to just describe what's going on, but we want to, you probably get it, explain someone's behavior. Why are they behaving the way they are? And that actually takes up by far the bulk of what we grapple with in the class. The third goal is not so much something we do in the class, but it is something that psychologists would like to be able to do, is to, well, if we think we understand behavior, can we predict behavior? And a lot of correlational research will look at, well, we may not be able to explain it, but we can predict that if somebody, gets a lot of sleep, that they will, we can predict what their success in school will look like. Is somebody who gets more sleep likely to be very successful in school or less successful? We can talk about that one in class. And then the last one, to control behavior. And this would be where we're not looking at something sinister like an authoritarian state is trying to control your behavior, but that by understanding and studying behavior, can we gain control of our own behavior, or maybe with the help of a counselor or therapist. I am probably not going to talk about those four goals of psychology again much or emphasize them, and I don't think they're in the textbook, but I like to ask a test question about them, so don't sleep on those. How is psychology doing with these four things? And yep, there's an announcement.
Can I have your attention, please? If your vehicle is parked in the bus parking lot, could you please move your vehicles as the buses cannot get in? Again, if you are parked in the bus parking lot, please go move your vehicle. Thank you.
Well, that's forever on my recording. I'm doing this on September 1st, before school starts. Anyway, how's psychology doing? You should actually be able to give an answer to that based on your summer reading, which is kind of a struggle. Not because psychologists are doing a bad job or they're bad psychologists, but because the nature of studying mental processes and behavior is a challenge. And so the field of psychology has made a lot of progress in terms of describing and explaining behavior, but not so much in terms of predicting, and maybe some progress in controlling, but all four of these are a challenge. So the quick answer for how is psychology doing is, it's a very mixed answer. there are several enduring questions that people have thought about for thousands of years that fit with the field of psychology, and I'm just going to kind of intro them here, and we will maybe deal with them here and there throughout the course. The first one is the relationship between the body and mind, and this one is actually huge. The body is tangible. You can touch it, you can see it, you can sense it. The mind is intangible. And remember, just a basic distinction, we're not talking about the body and the brain. The mind and the brain are two absolutely different things. The brain is part of the body. So we're talking about the mind. And that is where you run into trouble in psychology. I'm going to throw the word empirical at you. This doesn't have to do with an empire, but it has to do with measuring. So empirical means something that could be observed using the senses. It's not purely theoretical. It's not just based on logic or inference. It can be measured or quantified or observed. So you want to keep those three words, quantified, measured, observed, in your kind of thinking about that word, empirical. Another question that has kind of bedeviled people for thousands of years is, what's the relationship between the body and mind? Are they distinct or are they connected? If you think they are connected and really can't be separated from each other, then that would make you a monist, because you think they are one. If you think they are two separate things, then you are a dualist. That's the first big question. What's the relationship between the body and mind? The second one is, how do we know things? Do we learn through reason and kind of innate ideas that we all hold, or through experience? And this gets cast into a debate between rationalists and empiricists. A rationalist is somebody who says we possess innate ideas and reason. So that's a rationalist, that it's something within us. An empiricist would say that, like the word, it's got to come through the senses. You go back to the definition of the word, something that can be observed using the senses. So an empiricist is going to say that all knowledge comes through experience. Plato versus Aristotle. Plato was a rationalist. Aristotle was an empiricist. Plato thought that reality existed not in the concrete forms we recognize, like the chair that you're sitting in or the pen that you might be holding to take notes, but it is in the concept or the internal idea of a chair that we have in our heads. We reach truth not through our senses, but through our thoughts. Aristotle would have disagreed. He would have been the first to say we are a blank slate, and he can be quoted as saying there's nothing in the intellect without first being in the senses. Reality exists only in the concrete world of our senses. This debate continued up in through the Enlightenment period that many of you studied in 10th grade, between the debate between René Descartes and John Locke. Descartes, of course, is famous in the 1600s for saying cogito ergo sum, I think therefore I am. He believed in the power of deductive reasoning. Let me shut my window. And that reality has kind of a rational structure that can be grasped through logic and principle. And so he would have spent a lot of time on like geometry and proofs. John Locke, of course, believed in the tabula rasa, the blank slate. And so, again, there's a split between the rationalists and the empiricists. Immanuel Kant, a century later, attempts to unify, and he says, you got to have both. You got to have experience necessary for knowledge, but reason is necessary for processing the world. As it is, it's unknowable. So you got to have reason to make sense of it. He would have said that the mind shapes and structures our experience. So those are the first two kind of enduring questions that we've debated for hundreds of years. What's the relationship between the mind and the body, and how do we know what we know? There's a third one, the kind of nature versus nurture debate. This is unbelievable. It's right outside my office, and or my classroom. And I'm going to hold off on talking about the nature versus nurture debate for another day. What's the state of the debate today? Well, the easy answer would be it continues, but the reality is that one side has come to dominate. In the field of psychology, which side do you think dominates? The rationalists or the empiricists? And the answer would be it's the empiricists. Empiricism dominates science because of the use of the scientific method. You can't really do science except empirically. And so there's that word empirical again. So now we're going to go to the last part of the lecture, the early psychologists who attempted to study mental processes and behavior. You have the structuralists who tried to break our consciousness down to its component parts, almost like breaking things down to the periodic table of the elements in chemistry. The functionalists thought of it differently. Instead of breaking it down to its like essential building blocks, maybe thinking of things as a noun, like what are the structures, the functionalists thought of it as a verb. So they're saying, what's the mind for? What does it do? What's the action? And then the Gestalt theorists from Germany, that's how you say it. You don't say J or St. You say Gestalt with a SH in there. The Gestalt theorists said you've got to understand the whole. Talk a little bit about each one. Psychology begins with one dude, Wilhelm Wundt, and then continues with a second guy, Edward Titchener. So, but psych as kind of an independent science begins with Wundt. He studied there in Germany at the University of Leipzig, and he tried to study, this is a quote, "The exact description of consciousness is the sole aim of experimental psychology." He wanted to study our inner experience, aided by experimental methods. It is in 1879 that he builds the first psychology lab, and the field of psychology is, quote, born. It has almost a definite starting date. People were talking about the mind and our thinking and our behavior for hundreds, thousands of years, but this is the first kind of rigorous study of it in 1879. And he sets up this lab in Leipzig. The structuralists are not actually that important to remember. So there are only three things you need to remember about Wundt and the structuralists. Number one, he is the father of experimental psychology, or the kind of founder of. Two, and these are all connected, he established the first experimental psych lab. And three, he's the first to think of doing psych as a science, using experimental methods. The criticisms of the structuralists are that they're cataloging all these sensations that people are having. So they're having participants sit there and do kind of self-observation or introspection. But of course that is a scientific method, that's a way of studying it, but it's not a very good way because the observing subject is the observed subject, and so there's that kind of bias or conflict in there. It's very subjective and unreliable. So even at the dawn of psychology, we see the fundamental tension that still exists today of psych as a science. How do you actually scientifically study something intangible like the mind? And that is going to be something you've got to get used to. Whenever there's a question about why is it difficult to study psych as a science, you got to go back to, well, what we're trying to study is intangible, it's the mind, and that is hard to study scientifically. Titchener is actually a protege of Wundt. He studies under him, and then he comes back to America and adopts many of ideas and techniques, and he actually goes to a little school in central New York that you may have heard of called Cornell, and he establishes the first experimental psych lab here in the United States, and he calls his approach structuralism.
Can I have your attention, please? All ninth grade students, please finish up with your tours and then head to the buses. Again, please finish up with your tours, all ninth graders, and head to the buses. Thank you so much.
There you go. If there are any ninth graders listening, get to the buses. Wundt and Titchener are your structuralists. The second group that came along about the same time, this is all kind of late 1800s, maybe a little bit after, are William James and John Dewey, the functionalists. It is U.S.-based. It's a counter-movement to structuralism. Rather than ask kind of what are the elementary structures of the mind, functionalists ask, well, what do people do and why do they do it? So they're asking what's the function of the mind, not the structure, not what's it composed of, but what's the function. Functionalists were a very varied and disparate group. They were unified by those types of questions they asked that I mentioned, but not in the methods they used or their answers. William James and John Dewey are both huge figures in American history. Their key criticism of the structuralists is you cannot break consciousness down into elementary bits and pieces. You have to understand it as an active thing, as kind of a flow. And that idea of the flow of consciousness, or the word that the term that William James came up with, the stream of consciousness, is central to the functionalists. The functionalists don't last either. Their criticism are they're too vague and too many methods. It's not a very coherent theory. But they did establish that idea of the stream of consciousness. So other than them as a kind of counterweight to the structuralists and identifying James and Dewey as functionalists, you don't really need to know much about them. There's a piece of artwork called Stream of Consciousness trying to visually represent that idea that we're all very familiar with in our own internal heads. The third group, the Gestalt group, is probably the one that you have to remember at least a little bit of down the road. They arise in Germany, and they also disagreed with the structuralists for a similar but different reason. The Gestalt school also said you can't break down consciousness, but they said you can't break it down without understanding it. You can only understand it as a whole. It's kind of like if you wanted to understand the body of a frog, you could melt the frog down into it and separate it, through diffusion and centrifuges into, well, how much of it is copper and how much of it is carbon and how much is nitrogen. You could break it down into its structural parts, but you're not going to understand it when you've kind of broken it down to that level. Or even if you took it apart and said, here's the webbed foot, here's the leg, here's the mouth. You need to understand it as a whole. So that is the key to the Gestalt theorists, is you can only understand it as a whole. They have the key saying that you've heard, the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. Max Wertheimer is the key structuralist. You can see there's a Gestalt theory of perception. You can see there's a triangle visible to us in the figure on the left, but is there really a triangle there? We infer it, and then on the drawing on the right, you can see a tree with birds silhouetted in black, or you can also see a gorilla and a lion. The Gestalt theorists, we're going to talk about them twice in the course. One is during sensation and perception, and the second is during the therapy unit when we talk about Gestalt therapy. And that's my kind of comparison to you could break down the human body into its component elements, but would you really understand it? You have to understand humans as a whole. So that is the lecture, and I just remind you that when you think about these three things, the reason I did them as a a lecture only in class or online is they're not super important in the grand scheme of things, other than as kind of a framework. But the historical approaches are not really relevant anymore. So we're going to spend more of our time on the approaches that are still of relevance to us today. All right, see you in class.